The sound of the slap cracked through the air like thunder. A rich CEO, dressed in his polished suit and gold watch, had just struck a tomb guard across the face. The crowd froze. Gasps rose like a wave. Children clutched their parents. Veterans clenched their fists. Reporters raised cameras in disbelief. But the guard, he didn't move. He stood tall, still, silent, as if the blow had never landed. The CEO sneered, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Step aside. I own this place. I own everything." His words slithered through the silence, ugly and cold, but the guard's jaw never shook. His eyes never blinked. His weapon remained firm in his grip. Only the faint red mark across his cheek showed that something had even happened. The crowd expected fury. They expected the guard to break his vow of silence, to lash out, to shout, to defend himself, but instead, the opposite happened. The guard became stone, unshakable, unmoving. The perfect image of discipline. A little boy in the crowd whispered to his father, his voice trembling, "Why isn't he fighting back? He got hit." The father, an old veteran with tears welling in his eyes, whispered back, "Because honor doesn't fight for ego. Honor stands taller than insult." For a moment it felt as if time itself had stopped. The CEO adjusted his cufflinks, smirking, thinking he had won. But what he didn't know was that the world had just seen something unforgettable, that this was no ordinary clash. It was not about wealth or power. It was about respect, duty, and sacrifice. The slap was only the beginning. What came next would shake the crowd, the cameras, and even the arrogant man himself. The world thought the tomb guard would step aside, but in the next moment, they saw what true honor really means. Long before the slap echoed across that sacred ground, the guard had already lived through battles most people could not imagine. His name was not known to the crowd. No badge carried his story. No reporter could list his scars. But buried deep, inside his chest was the memory of a battlefield, smoke in the air, brothers in arms falling one by one, and a best friend whispering his last words before the silence of death. That friend's name was Daniel Carter, a soldier who had once promised, "If I don't make it home, tell my family I stood my ground." The guard never forgot. Every step he took since that day, every command he obeyed, every hour he stood silent before the tomb, it was all for Daniel. And for the countless others who never got to walk back into the arms of their families. He had been offered promotions. He had been offered easier posts. But he refused. "This post is not about me," he once told his commanding officer. "It's about them, the ones who gave everything." That is why he stood there now, under the burning sun, in rain, in snow, in silence, guarding a tomb that symbolized not one soldier, but all of them, the nameless, the faceless, the forgotten dot. The location itself was sacred. Every stone was laid to remind the living that freedom is not free. Tourists often arrived in laughter, but they left in silence. Veterans approached with tears. Children asked questions that made their parents proud, and the guard, he never flinched. He never spoke. His role was a promise carved into his very soul, but not everyone respected it. That day, among the crowd of tourists and mourners, stood a man who believed money outweighed honor, a man known for his sharp business deals, his wealth displayed like a crown, his arrogance sharper than any blade. His name was Richard Holstrom, a CEO worth billions, featured in magazines, admired by politicians, feared by his employees. To him, respect was something that could be bought, like a car, a mansion, or a seat at the world's most exclusive tables. Richard had arrived that day not to pay respect, but to prove power. With cameras following him, bodyguards in tow, and a smirk etched across his face, he saw the tomb not as sacred ground, but as a stage. He believed no man, no god, no tradition could stand in his way. He had bribed politicians, silenced judges, bent laws until they cracked. And now he wanted to test something different, whether silence itself could be broken. The whispers among the crowd told stories of him. That's the billionaire who shut down a factory and left hundreds jobless. That's the man who boasted about buying senators like stock shares. That's the man who said discipline was for the poor. But to the guard, none of that mattered. The uniform demanded one thing only: discipline. No matter who stood before him, no matter the insult. That clash, a soldier shaped by loss and honor, and a CEO molded by greed and arrogance, was a storm waiting to explode. And the tomb itself seemed to sense it. The silence that hung over those stones was not empty. It was alive, heavy. Every name carved into marble seemed to whisper, "Respect us, do not cross the line." The veterans in the crowd felt it in their bones. The children, even without words, understood they were standing where heroes slept. And yet Richard stepped forward with his smirk, his polished shoes tapping against sacred ground, each step louder than the last. For the guard, it wasn't the man he was watching. It was the test, a test he knew would come someday. The test of whether his vow, the promise to never move, never break, never let disrespect pass, could survive against the ugliest insult. When Richard's hand finally swung across the guard's face, it was not just skin that was struck. It was memory. It was sacrifice. It was the very idea of honor itself. The crowd gasped not only because of the violence, but because they understood the weight of the ground they were standing on. This was not a slap to a man. It was a slap to the dead. A slap to every soldier who had stood, fought, and fallen. And though Richard thought he had proven his power, what he had really done was awaken something much larger than himself. For in the silence of that unmoving guard, in the red mark across his cheek, in the stillness that refused to bend, the world was about to witness what money could never buy. The slap was only the beginning. Richard Holstrom's hand dropped back to his side, the smirk on his lips stretching wider as he looked around at the gasping crowd. He enjoyed the sound of their disbelief. He fed on it like fire. See, he sneered loudly, his voice echoing against the marble. Nothing happens. Nothing at all. Just a statue in uniform. That's what discipline gets you. Silence. Reporters raised their cameras higher, the shutters clicking like rain. Their footage would soon flood the world. Parents pulled their children closer, shielding their eyes, yet unable to look away themselves. The guard did not blink. He did not flinch. His cheek still carried the sting of the slap, but his eyes stayed fixed ahead, locked in that sacred duty. Richard stepped closer, his polished shoes clicking sharply with each step. "Do you even hear me?" he mocked. "Are you even a man, or just a toy dressed up for show?" A little girl in the crowd whispered nervously, "Daddy, why won't he say anything?" Her father's jaw tightened. He knew the answer, but explaining it to a child, in this moment, with this spectacle unfolding, was nearly impossible. One of the veterans in the crowd finally couldn't hold his voice back. His hand shook with anger as he shouted, "You're standing on the ground of heroes, show some respect." Richard turned sharply, laughing. Respect. He stretched his arms out, as if he owned the very air around him. Respect is bought. My friend and I have more of it than anyone here. The veteran's face flushed red, his fists clenching. Another veteran stepped forward, but a guard nearby raised a discreet hand, signaling them to hold back. This was not their battle. Richard turned back toward the tomb guard, circling him now like a predator taunting prey. His gold watch caught the sunlight, throwing sharp glints into the crowd. "You're nothing but a puppet," Richard hissed, a man too afraid to fight back. "Do you know who I am? Do you know how many politicians answer my calls?" Stillness. Silence. Stone. The guard remained locked in his vow. Every second he refused to respond was a second Richard grew more restless. Cameras zoomed in. The red mark on the guard's cheek became a symbol. Veterans whispered to one another about dignity. Mothers pressed their children's heads against their chests, shielding them from the arrogance on display. Richard leaned in close, his voice dropping to a cold whisper meant only for the guard. "Your silence makes you weak, and I'll prove it." He raised his hand again, but this time, instead of slapping, he flicked the brim of the guard's hat. A small, sharp motion, deliberate and mocking. The hat barely moved, but the insult was clear. Gasps echoed once more. The crowd began to shift. The uneasy tension was becoming anger, boiling like a storm. People pulled out phones, live streaming, their voices trembling as they narrated what they were witnessing. A boy no older than 10 gripped his grandfather's sleeve and whispered, "Why doesn't someone stop him?" The old man's eyes watered as he answered softly, "Because the guard already has." Richard, hearing murmurs ripple through the crowd, raised his voice. "You think this silence is strength? No, it's weakness, and weakness should bow to power." He puffed his chest out, walking even closer until his nose was nearly inches from the guards. The tomb guard remained still, breathing evenly, eyes forward. The crowd was now split between terror and awe. Some shouted angrily at Richard to stop, others simply covered their mouths, unable to believe what they were witnessing. Reporters leaned in closer, their microphones trembling in their hands, capturing every word, every insult. Richard's voice rose higher, his arrogance spilling into rage. "You people worship statues and silence, while I build empires. This man is nothing. A wall dressed in uniform. He stands here while I live, and living means winning." But with each word, his power seemed smaller, because no matter how loud he grew, the guard's silence grew louder. The veterans in the crowd began standing taller, shoulders squared, eyes glistening with pride. The children, though confused, began to sense something powerful, that the man in uniform was not weak at all. He was stronger than the slap, stronger than the insults, stronger than arrogance itself. Richard grew restless. His voice cracked with frustration. Say something, anything, prove you're more than a shadow. But the guard did not move, and in that stillness the weight of sacrifice pressed heavier on the crowd. They began to feel it. The names carved in marble, the men and women who never came home, the silence that honored them. Richard, feeling the crowd shift against him, grew more reckless. He shoved the guard's shoulder hard. The guard's body shifted slightly with the force, but his boots returned to their precise stance instantly, perfectly aligned, as if planted into the very earth itself. Gasps became shouts. Veterans cursed under their breath. Children clung to their parents. Reporters whispered into microphones, their voices trembling. Ladies and gentlemen, you are witnessing an unprecedented scene. A billionaire CEO has just struck and shoved a tomb guard, and yet the guard, he does not move, he does not respond. The air was electric, heavy, suffocating. Every heart in the crowd seemed to pound in unison. Every camera lens trembled. Every whisper carried the same thought. Something historic was unfolding before their eyes. Richard wiped sweat from his brow. His arrogance was beginning to falter, replaced by desperation. He had thrown every insult he could think of, and yet, the silence remained. The guard's stillness was no longer weakness. It was power. And everyone in the crowd could feel it. Richard clenched his jaw, his voice breaking with rage. You think you can ignore me? You think silence wins? I'll show you what happens when you defy Richard Holstrom. And with that, he crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Richard Holstrom's face was red with rage now, his voice breaking, his arrogance slipping into desperation. He had slapped, mocked, taunted, shoved, and still the tomb guard refused to bend. Fine, Richard spat. If silence is all you have, then silence will be broken. The crowd watched in horror as Richard reached forward and grabbed the guard's ceremonial rifle. His gold watch clinked against the metal as he yanked at it, trying to rip it from the soldier's grip. Gasps erupted, louder than before. A woman screamed. A child began to cry. The veterans in the crowd surged forward, their instinct screaming to protect the guard, to stop this madness. But a military officer near the line of guards raised his hand firmly, commanding them to stand back. He knew something the crowd did not. He knew the discipline of the tomb guards was absolute, and that any break in their silence meant something extraordinary was about to happen. Richard tugged hard, snarling, "Let go. This is nothing but a prop, a toy." But the rifle did not move. The guard's grip was unshakable, his arms steady as iron, his eyes remained locked forward, refusing to even acknowledge Richard's presence. The silence grew unbearable. Every heartbeat in the crowd seemed louder than words. And then Richard made his final mistake. In a fit of rage, he leaned forward and shoved the guard hard in the chest with both hands. The force echoed against the uniform, but the guard's boots slammed back into position with military precision. The crowd gasped again, the sound almost a single cry. The children clung tighter to their parents. Veterans clenched their fists, muttering prayers and curses under their breath. For a long, breathless moment, it seemed as if nothing had changed. The guard remained still, silent, unmoving, but then, he moved. The shift was small, precise, controlled, but it was enough to make the crowd erupt in a collective gasp. With flawless precision, the guard snapped his rifle upward, breaking the silence with the sharp metallic crack of movement. The motion was not wild, not chaotic, but disciplined, a weapon drill executed with the force of authority. The barrel stopped just inches from Richard's chest, not touching, not threatening recklessly, but clear, direct, commanding. The crowd fell into a silence so deep it felt sacred. Even the birds above seemed to stop their flight. And then, for the first time in hours, for the first time that many in the crowd had ever heard, the guard spoke. His voice was low, steady, carved from stone. "Do not disrespect." Fallen, the words cut through the air like a blade. 3 short sentences, each one striking harder than Richard's slap ever could. The crowd froze, their mouths open, their hearts pounding. Veterans stood straighter, tears glistening in their eyes. Children stopped crying, their faces filled with awe. Richard stumbled back, his arrogance crumbling. For the first time, his smirk was gone. Sweat pooled on his forehead, his lips parted, but no words came out. The guard did not chase him, did not move closer, did not break discipline beyond that one necessary action. He simply stood tall. Rifle returned to perfect stance, his eyes forward once again, as if nothing had happened, but everything had happened. The silence that followed was deafening, not a cough, not a whisper, not even the rustle of clothing. And then, almost like a wave breaking, the crowd exhaled together. Some clapped instinctively, others cried openly. Veterans saluted, their hands trembling as they raised them. A child's voice broke through, small but piercing. "He's a hero." The father who stood beside that child whispered back, tears streaming down his face. "No, he's more than that. He's honor itself." Richard staggered backward, his chest heaving, his pride shattered. His billion-dollar empire meant nothing in this moment. His expensive suit, his gold watch, his name, all of it shrank to nothing against the weight of one soldier's vow. The reporters' cameras captured everything: the slap, the insults, the shove, the rifle snap, the 3 words that shook the air. The footage would soon travel across the world, but for those standing there, in that sacred silence, it was already eternal. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. His voice, so loud moments ago, had been stolen by the very silence he mocked. The guard had spoken only once, and it was enough. As the seconds stretched, Richard realized the truth. He had not humiliated the guard. He had humiliated himself. And as military police began to move quietly through the crowd, their eyes fixed on Richard, the crowd understood what they had witnessed was not an act of anger, but an act of disciplined defiance. The tomb had been defended, not with fists, not with chaos, but with the unshakable strength of silence and honor, and now, the world would never forget. The silence after the guard's words lingered like a sacred echo. Do not disrespect the fallen. 3 simple commands, yet they carried the weight of every soldier who never came home. Richard Holstrom stood frozen, sweat dripping down his face, his arrogance shattered. His gold watch, once a symbol of power, now glistened like chains. He opened his mouth to reply, but his voice betrayed him, stuttering, broken, hollow. The crowd stared. They had witnessed a billionaire try to conquer silence, and lose. Then, movement rippled at the edges of the crowd. 2 military police officers, dressed in crisp uniforms, stepped forward. Their expressions were calm but unyielding. They didn't need to raise their voices. Their presence alone was enough. "Sir," one of them said firmly to Richard, "you're coming with us." Richard's head whipped around. "What? You can't arrest me. Do you know who I am?" His voice cracked with desperation, a sharp contrast to the polished confidence he once wore. "I own companies. I own campaigns. You can't do this to me." But his pleas fell flat. The officers closed in, their grip firm on his arms. The crowd watched in silence, some recording, others whispering in disbelief. The once feared CEO dragged like a child throwing a tantrum. "Let me go," Richard screamed. "This is a mistake. This man assaulted me." He pointed frantically at the guard, his words echoing through the open space. But the guard did not move. He did not flinch. He did not respond. His duty remained the same. His stance, perfect. His silence, absolute. The contrast was striking. Richard thrashing, shouting, shrinking by the second. The guard standing still, calm, eternal. And the crowd understood the truth. Chaos had already lost. A veteran in the front row raised his hand in salute, his eyes wet. Others followed, row by row, until dozens of hands stood rigid in the air. Children looked on wide-eyed, whispering to their parents about the meaning of honor. Reporters' microphones shook as they whispered into their feeds. History has just been made. The tomb guard has held his vow against unimaginable disrespect. The aggressor, billionaire Richard Holstrom, is now in custody. The footage was already spreading, live streams catching fire across the internet. Millions would soon see the moment, the slap, the insults, the rifle snap, and the words that silenced arrogance. But for those present, the moment felt eternal, carved into memory deeper than stone. As Richard was dragged away, his voice cracked into pitiful protests. "I'll sue, I'll ruin all of you." But no one listened. For the first time in his life, Richard Holstrom's words meant nothing. The officers disappeared into the distance, taking the broken CEO with them. And as the last echoes of his tantrum faded, silence returned to the sacred ground. The guard, his face still marked by the red slap, shifted his rifle back into flawless stance, his boots aligned, his chin lifted, his gaze forward. As if nothing had happened, as if chaos had never touched him. The symbolism struck the crowd like lightning. The world had just witnessed money, arrogance, and power crash against the wall of duty and shatter. A young boy whispered to his mother, he didn't even need to fight. He just stood. The mother squeezed his shoulder gently. That's what real strength looks like. For the guard, it was not victory. It was not pride. It was simply duty. The same vow he carried yesterday, the same vow he would carry tomorrow, but for everyone else. It was a story they would carry for the rest of their lives, and in that moment, the tomb itself seemed to speak, not with words, but with silence, the silence of the fallen. Honored once again by the living, the world would never forget the sight, a guard standing tall, a slap unanswered by rage, a silence louder than power. The echoes of Richard Holstrom's protests had long faded into the distance. The officers who escorted him away were gone, leaving behind only silence and the steady rhythm of the guard's stance. The crowd remained, however, unwilling to leave. Something about what they had witnessed anchored them to the ground, as though stepping away would mean breaking the spell of history. A senior officer, a decorated colonel with silver in his hair, stepped forward. His medals glinted softly in the light as he approached the guard. For a moment he stood silently beside him, shoulders squared, eyes locked forward, and in a gesture rarely seen, the colonel raised his hand in a crisp salute. He held it there, for several seconds, his eyes glistening. Finally, he lowered his hand and whispered words only the guard could hear, on behalf of the fallen, and on behalf of every soldier who has ever worn this uniform. Thank you. The guard, true to his vow, did not respond. He did not nod, did not shift, did not break his silence. But in the subtle tightening of his jaw, the faint flicker in his eyes, the colonel understood. The crowd stirred softly, whispers spreading like ripples in water. He didn't move for the slap, he didn't move for the shove. But when the fallen were insulted, he spoke. Among them stood a small boy, barely 10, holding his father's hand. He tugged at his sleeve and whispered, his voice trembling but clear enough for those around to hear. "Daddy, he's a hero." The father knelt down, his voice heavy with emotion. "No, son," he said gently. "He's what heroes guard. He's honor itself." The boy's eyes shone, the word honor settling into his young heart like a seed that would never die. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, the guard remained motionless. Tourists wiped tears from their cheeks. Veterans left in silence, their salutes still lingering in the air. Reporters packed their equipment carefully, realizing that the footage they carried was more than news, it was history. And when the last of the footsteps faded into the distance, the guard was alone once more. The silence was complete. The sacred ground returned to its eternal stillness. In that silence, the guard's thoughts drifted inward, not to Richard Holstrom, not to the cameras, not to the applause of strangers, but to Daniel Carter, his fallen friend, the man whose last breath had been a promise to stand ground. Beneath his uniform, tucked close to his heart, was a small, worn dog tag. The name etched into it had grown faint with time, but the guard knew every curve of every letter by memory. In that private, unseen moment, his thumb pressed gently against the metal. A silent salute, a vow renewed. "I stood my ground, brother, just as you asked, just as you would have done." The red mark on his cheek burned faintly still, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the stillness, the silence, the honor unbroken. The sun lowered toward the horizon, stretching long shadows across the marble. The guard stood exactly as he had been trained, boots aligned, rifle steady, gaze forward. To the world, it was just another day's watch. To him, it was a promise kept, and to those who had witnessed it, it was proof that silence can be stronger than power, and that honor can outlive arrogance. The guard did not smile, he did not bow, he did not move, he simply stood, and in that stillness, the fallen were never forgotten. Some stories don't need 1,000 voices to be remembered. Sometimes, all it takes is silence. On that sacred ground, a billionaire tried to prove that money could buy respect, that arrogance could break tradition, that power could bend duty. And yet he failed, because standing before him was something he could never own. A soldier, a guard, a man bound not by fear, not by pride, but by honor. One slap, one shove, one insult after another, and still the guard did not break. When he finally moved, it wasn't out of anger. It wasn't out of ego. It was out of loyalty to the fallen, to the brothers and sisters whose names live forever in stone. And in 3 words. Do not disrespect the fallen, the world learned. A lesson too many had forgotten. Tradition is not weakness. Stillness is strength. That moment is now etched into history, not because of the man who shouted, but because of the guard who stood silent. Because discipline always outlasts chaos. Because honor cannot be bought. If this story touched you, if it reminded you of the sacrifices made by those who never came home, share it. Pass it on. Let the world see that silence can be louder than power. And remember, when arrogance shouts, honor doesn't need to answer. It only needs to stand. To every soldier past and present, we thank you. To every family who has carried the weight of sacrifice, We remember you. If you believe in their legacy, don't just watch, join the circle of remembrance. Subscribe, share, and keep their stories alive, because heroes may fall, but honor never does.